Have you ever wondered who held the tools behind the screams in a medieval dungeon? Tonight, we slip into the shadows to follow the brutal life of a man paid to inflict pain in the name of justice. As the firelight flickers and the air goes quiet, take a deep breath and relax. By the way, what time are you watching this story? Let us know in the comments below, because for the next little bit, we'll slowly explore the quiet torment and heavy burden carried by those who lived behind the iron gates and stone walls. A story not of power, but of punishment, not of glory, but of silence. Welcome to the brutal life of a medieval torturer. He was not born with a whip in hand, nor a hood upon his head. He was a boy like any other, running through muddy village paths with calloused feet and a belly half full. But fate in the Middle Ages rarely offered kindness to those born in the lower rungs of society. The blacksmith was the first to notice him lingering near the forge after the other boys had left. He took the boy in, not out of kindness, but because the constable owed him a favor. And that favor meant training a new apprentice for the torturer whose last assistant had disappeared into the forest one night without a word. The dungeon was nothing like the tales whispered around hearths. There were no swinging chains or blood-slicked walls, just a damp, hollow place that swallowed sound. The smell of rot mildew and fear clung to the stones like a second skin. His first task was to scrub those stones clean. Though they would never stay that way, every week brought a new prisoner in with them, new stains. The boy's arms ached, but he did not complain, because silence was expected. The torturer spoke little and never smiled. He issued commands like hold this or fetch that, and the boy obeyed without question. Asking why was never part of the job. There was a book kept under lock, a heavy leather-bound volume filled with drawings and instructions. Racks, thumbscrews, and other strange tools filled the pages like a nightmare carved in ink, each night by flickering candlelight. The boy was told to study it and memorize every method. His first lesson came with a thief, a man accused of stealing bread from the bishop's cellar. The torturer prepared the tools, while the boy stood frozen near the wall. When the man screamed, the boy flinched, but the torturer forced him to watch without turning away. "You must never look away," the torturer said, "or the screams will follow you into your dreams." The thief's cries rose like wind through broken branches, wild and trembling. That night, the boy lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. More prisoners came, and the boy kept learning how to heat iron without weakening it, how to sharpen nails without splintering them, how to wash away blood without leaving a trace. Each task became a ritual more about precision than punishment. Not everyone who came to the dungeon was guilty, and the boy began to notice it. He asked the torturer once why they still hurt them. The answer was quiet and cold, because it was not about guilt, but control. His hands began to change, growing harder, more practiced in the routines of pain. His breath stayed steady now, even as bones cracked or skin tore. He did not tremble anymore, only watched and worked. The villagers began to avoid him, crossing the street or muttering prayers as he passed. They saw not a boy, but something darker now, something touched by shadows. Laughter felt so distant now, almost like a strange echo. In the dark, he would press his hands together, wondering when they stopped feeling like his own. Memories of his mother slipped away, fading like smoke from a dying fire. After a year, he no longer needed instructions. He prepared tools before they were requested and recognized which prisoners would resist and which ones would break. He had learned everything except how to forget. A quiet numbness wrapped around his heart like an invisible chain. He had built a wall inside himself that kept the screams at a distance, because if he ever let them in too deep, he feared he would disappear like the last apprentice and never return. Every tool in the dungeon had a purpose, and behind each purpose was knowledge of the body. The torturer did not simply guess where to press or strike. He had learned over time which nerves brought agony and which ones brought silence. The boy learned it too, with time and trembling hands. He watched the torturer press down on a prisoner's thigh just beneath the bone. The man screamed so loud, the candlelight flickered against the stone. Some pain was sharp like lightning in the joints. Other pain was dull and heavy, crawling up the spine like a slow sickness. Knowing the difference meant knowing how long someone could last before they passed out or died. The torturer once said, "The goal is never death. Death ends the pain, and pain was the point." The body had to be kept alive, but just barely, so the soul would wish otherwise. They began to draw diagrams in the dirt between sessions. The boy learned where the ribs could be bent without breaking, where the jaw could be pulled and still speak. They practiced on pigs at first, which were said to feel pain, much like people. The boy winced at the squeals, but didn't look away. This was learning, he reminded himself, not cruelty. He was taught the difference between a bruise and a break, between a scream of fear and a scream of true agony. The human body was a map, and the torturer had memorized every path that led to suffering. Certain areas were sacred in their effectiveness. The soft flesh under the arms, the soles of the feet, the inside of the thighs, places where nerves ran close to skin and where pressure meant torment. Hot coals placed slowly near the skin without touching it could make a man confess before a single burn. The smell alone was enough to unravel the mind. Sometimes fear was sharper than any blade. There were tools shaped for specific joints, metal claws to spread fingers until they popped, rods to twist ankles and arms with cold precision. The boy was not allowed to use them at first. He only watched and memorized. But one day the torturer stepped back and said, "Now you try." His hands shook as he reached for the iron. He did not want to, but his body moved anyway. The prisoner cried out before the boy even made contact, as if the presence of fear was pain enough. He pressed down slowly, unsure if he was doing it right. The torturer gave no instruction, only watched. The silence was heavier than any chain in the room. When it was over, the boy stepped back, pale and sweating. The torturer handed him a cloth to wipe the blood. He said nothing but nodded once, and that was enough. From then on, the boy was expected to help, not just clean. He became part of the process, not just a witness. His hands learned to move with purpose, even if his heart begged to stop. The torturer explained that the neck and the spine were never to be touched, unless it was the end. Those were sacred places where life balanced too close to death. Every other part was fair game. They studied pressure points, using dull blades and wooden pegs. Pain could be localized, or it could travel like a wave. Knowing how to control the direction was considered a skill few mastered. Sometimes they kept prisoners awake for days before touching them. Exhaustion wore down resistance like rain carving stone. A tired man would tell secrets faster than a fresh one ever could. There was an art to the silence between each action. Too fast, and the body shut down; too slow, and the mind wandered. Timing was as vital as the tool in hand. He learned that laughter could sometimes break a man quicker than pain. The torturer would whisper stories or jokes in the prisoner's ear. The cruelty of comfort in a place of torment broke something deeper than flesh. The dungeon became a classroom of shadows. Each scream was a lesson, each gasp a signal. The boy became fluent in a language no one should ever have to speak. He learned that screams came in rhythms. Short bursts meant surprise, long howls meant deep pain, silence meant something worse. Silence meant the mind was slipping or the body was failing. On colder nights, the torturer would speak more, not of his past, but of the human body, like a scholar might discuss a rare book. He said the body is fragile, but the mind is more so, and it takes less than you think to crack it. He explained how fear traveled the blood faster than infection, how eyes could betray a man before his tongue did, how some pain left no scars, and those were the worst kind. The boy began to write down what he could, scraps of parchment, hidden in his cot, covered in shaky notes and crude drawings. He wasn't sure why, maybe to understand, or maybe to one day forget. Each prisoner became a new problem to solve. Some were silent monks, Others were arrogant knights. All of them bled the same in the end, and that made the boy feel something strange and bitter. He started to hear screams in his sleep, even when the dungeon was empty. They echoed through his dreams like ghosts knocking on the walls of his skull. No candle was bright enough to keep them out. Yet each morning he returned to the chamber and the tools, not because he wanted to, but because there was no other road left. Pain had become his language, and the anatomy of suffering his only truth. Every instrument in the dungeon had a name and a purpose. They were not chosen for their cruelty alone, but for their message. Each tool whispered something different into the ears of those who watched from the outside. The rack was one of the oldest and most feared. Its wooden frame stretched the body inch by inch until joints separated with a wet pop. Screams from the rack echoed longer than any other sound within those stone walls. Then there were the iron boots, cold metal coverings filled with spikes driven onto the feet of prisoners. One turn of the screw would press the spikes deeper until the bones beneath cracked like dry twigs. The boy remembered the first time he cleaned the boots after use. Blood had pooled at the toes and bits of flesh clung to the iron. He scrubbed in silence, trying not to think of the man who once wore them. The pair of anguish was the most disturbing to him, shaped like a flower, but forged in iron. It opened slowly inside the mouth or other soft places. Its beauty was a lie designed to conceal its horror. There was a smaller version for women accused of lying, or worse, it was whispered among the guards, but never discussed aloud. The boy found it wrapped in cloth and hidden in a chest, as if even the torturer wished it forgotten. Thumb screws seemed simple, yet caused unimaginable pain. They crushed bones slowly with every turn, forcing prisoners to confess with shaking voices. The boy was taught how to tighten them just enough, not to shatter, but to stretch suffering. Hot irons were used not just to burn, but to control. One close pass near the skin was often enough to loosen a stubborn tongue. If not, the glowing metal would soon press into flesh, leaving behind a brand that never faded. The strappito used gravity as a weapon. Prisoners were hoisted by their arms, tied behind their backs, then dropped suddenly. Shoulders tore from sockets, and silence usually followed soon after. There was a smaller tool called the heretic's fork, a metal rod with prongs on both ends placed between chin and chest, or chin and throat. It kept the head up and prevented sleep with the threat of stabbing pain. Water torture was quieter than the others, a steady drip on the forehead or slow pouring into the mouth while the nose was sealed. The boy found this method unsettling because it lacked the drama of blood, but not the terror. The Iron Maiden was rarely used, but always shown. Its spike-lined interior and hinged doors made it more of a warning than a weapon. Prisoners who saw it often confessed before even being touched. Chains hung from the walls in tangled clumps. Each one was worn with rust and age stained by time and use. They were not instruments themselves, but they held the victim steady while the real work began. There were lesser-known tools with no names, wooden wedges that split knees open, metal coils that crushed, ribbed slowly. Even sharpened feathers dipped in brine used on open wounds to make them scream again. Each tool had to be maintained carefully. Rust dulled their message, and broken parts made them useless. The boys spent hours sharpening edges, oiling hinges, and polishing wood until they shined in the candlelight. He began to understand that these tools were symbols as much as weapons. They told the people outside that law had power and that defiance meant pain. The tools spoke when words failed. Sometimes the torturer would explain their history while they worked. He spoke of older times when such tools were used in public squares. Crowds gathered not to see justice, but to feel safe by watching someone else suffer. He said, fear was a currency, and the tools were how it was spent. Each scream was a coin paid to keep. Peace, each confession a receipt written in blood. The boy started to see the beauty in their design, and that scared him. How the gears turned perfectly, how the screws tightened with soft clicks. There was a kind of order in the cruelty that felt almost pure. He wondered who made these tools and whether they slept at night. Did they feel pride or shame or nothing at all? Were they craftsmen or accomplices? He asked the torturer once where the tools came from. The man only said some were gifts from kings, others were made by hands long dead. The tools outlived those who wielded them and those who screamed beneath them. The boy began to dream of the tools, not as weapons, but as living things. They crept through his mind in the dark, grinding and stretching, twisting and burning. He sometimes woke with phantom pains in his own hands. Once he thought he heard the faint creak of a rack. Even though the dungeon was empty, the tools were part of him now, and he could feel them even when he wasn't near them. Eventually, he learned to choose the right tool for each job. Not too fast, not too slow, always just enough. A confession, drawn out, was more valuable than one given in haste. Some tools were used only once and then hidden away. Others became part of the daily ritual. Their presence, as normal as bread or water. The dungeon was a forge, and he was both the hammer and the heat. The villagers never saw the tools, but they spoke of them with reverence and dread. They imagined shapes they had never seen and screams they had never heard. That imagination often did more than the tools ever could. The boy kept a small piece of iron in his pocket one day, broken off from an old clamp. He told himself it was for luck or protection, but deep down he knew it was a tether, something to remind him of what he had become. He did not know if the tools made him powerful or hollow, but each day he touched them, cleaned them, used them, and each night they waited for him in the shadows like old friends. Confessions were the goal. Not truth, not justice, just the spoken words that sealed a man's fate. The torturer did not care if they were lies, only that they were said aloud. The dungeon echoed most clearly during those moments. When a voice cracked and the words spilled out like blood, "I did it," or "I was with them," or "Please stop, please stop, please stop." The boy quickly learned that people broke in different ways. Some needed only to see the tools laid out neatly on the table. Others held out for hours, even days, clinging to silence like a prayer. One prisoner came in proud and shouting, claiming innocence with every breath. He spat at the torturer and sneered at the boy. But after the second night, he begged them to stop sobbing, that he'd say anything if they let him sleep. Sleep was often the first thing taken. Prisoners were kept awake until their minds began to fray and time lost meaning. Even before pain came, the body had already started to collapse. Confessions under torture were slippery things. Sometimes a man admitted to stealing grain when he had only borrowed it. Sometimes a woman claimed to consort with devils, just to make the heat stop pressing into her skin. The torturer kept a book with names and dates. The boy was made to write down the confessions, even as they were screamed. Shaky hands tried to match the speed of the voice echoing through stone walls. Some begged for mercy after speaking. Others cursed the torturer even as their own blood dried on the floor. A few stayed silent even after confessing, as if the words had drained all breath from their lungs. The boy found these moments the hardest to watch. Not the pain, but the breaking of something invisible. The soul, or the will, or the final piece of a man that made him human. One old farmer confessed to killing his neighbor, though he hadn't. He had only argued over land, but the Lord demanded someone be punished. The confession saved his family's home and cost him 3 fingers and his voice. Sometimes children were brought in, accused of stealing or lying or worse. The torturer would grow quiet then, and his hands moved slower as if memory weighed them down. One boy, no older than 12, confessed to witchcraft after 2 hours on the rack. His voice cracked like old wood, and he couldn't walk afterward. The boy apprentice helped carry him back to the cell and did not sleep that night. Noblemen were the worst. They screamed the loudest and lied the most. Their confessions were often rehearsed before the torture began, whispered by lawyers or priests who told them what to say, to end it quickly. But the torturer didn't care if the confessions were real. He once told the boy, "The truth is not what matters, only the silence after the screaming. It's the moment when the room grows still and the body stops fighting." The boy began to recognize the signs of an approaching confession, the twitch in the leg, the shift in the voice, the way a prisoner stared at the ceiling like it held all the answers. He could smell it coming like a storm in the distance. The worst part was hearing the same lies repeated over and over. Men admitting to crimes they didn't understand just to make the pain end. Women naming other women as witches just to breathe without fire against their skin. One woman screamed her sister's name. The boy had seen them brought in together, accused of sorcery. After the confession, they were never allowed to see each other again. The torturer never smiled during confessions. He only nodded once the words were spoken and motioned for the boy to stop the tools. Sometimes he gave water, sometimes he walked away without a word. A confession ended the session, but never the punishment. Some were sentenced to hang, others to be burned or broken or sent to the mines. The boy wondered what was the point of confession if it only led to more suffering. He asked the torturer once whether any man ever told the truth in that room. The torturer answered, "All of them do, and none of them do. It depends on who is listening." The boy began to write down the names of the confessed on small scraps of cloth. He tied them into knots and hid them behind loose stones in the dungeon wall. It felt like a small mercy, something to hold onto when nothing else made sense. He thought about the power of a voice and how easily it could be stolen. How a scream could be turned into a sentence into a grave, all from one moment of unbearable pain. Sometimes confessions came too late. One prisoner bled out on the table just after whispering the truth. The torturer only shrugged and said, "The words still count." The boy hated the word confession. It felt wrong, like a lie dressed as a prayer. There was no relief in it, only exhaustion and silence. Yet he kept recording them day after day, because someone had to remember what was said, even if it wasn't real. 'Cause if no one wrote it down, the pain would vanish like smoke, and that somehow felt worse. He learned to speak softly during sessions, to coax words out rather than rip them. The torturer approved, said fear works best when it wears a gentle face. Some prisoners confessed before a hand was laid on them. The boy wondered what fear lived in their minds to break them so quickly. Perhaps Tanch's reputation was stronger than any tool ever made. The confessions echoed even when the dungeon was empty. The boy sometimes sat in silence and still heard them bouncing off the walls, like ghosts whispering the past. No candle could chase them away for long. He began to understand that the confessions weren't for the prisoners. They were for the lords, the bishops, the nobles who needed proof of order. Pain created words, and words created peace, even if only for a while. He was not a monster, not completely. The torturer lived by rules, though he never spoke them aloud. They were carved into his actions, not his words, passed from one hand to another in silence, in the way he looked at the floor. Before touching certain tools, no fire ever came close. It was as if they held something sacred, even in the cruelest man. The boy noticed these rules slowly like shadows that moved but never spoke. He was never told them, but he felt them in the way the torturer paused at certain moments. And when it burned past a certain mark, he would stop, even if the prisoner hadn't spoken. One rule was never the eyes. No tool ever touched them. Another rule was time. There was a limit to how long a session lasted. The torturer watched the candle closely. There were no beatings of the sick. If a prisoner came in shivering or coughing, they were returned to their cell. Pain was meant for the strong. The tortured were to be broken, not destroyed. The face was identity, and that was never to be taken. If a prisoner was to walk free someday, they should still recognize themselves in water. The boy once asked if these rules were written somewhere, like they were made of glass. His hands trembled. Once. after a session with a child, and the boy never forgot it. Every trace of suffering was cleaned, scrubbed, burned, or buried. The same prayer whispered under his breath before the work began. It was not religious, just necessary. The torturer only shook his head and said, "They are kept in the soul, not the scroll. Some things you feel or you don't, and if you don't, you should never be here." If a man screamed too soon, the torture ended. If he held out too long, he was praised, even if just with a nod. The dance between fear and endurance was the heart of the work. His hands needed to be steady and his mind clear. Drunkenness dulled the edge and blurred the judgment needed in the dark. He said it was about respect, not for the prisoner, but for the craft. The iron must never grow dull or proud. Laughed, bled, spat, screamed, and cursed, but the torturer never raised his voice and never touched the man's mouth. When orders came, he passed them to others and walked away without a word. Not from the guards, not from the boy, not from the torturer himself. Laughter in the dungeon was a sin worse than pain, and it would echo longer than any scream. Pain lost its voice when overused, he said. The second scream was never as pure as the first. The torturer did not return to work the next day. He sat in his chamber alone and said nothing. The dungeon remained still, cold as bone and thick with quiet. He kept in a small book locked in a box, not of those he tortured, but of those he refused to touch. Old friends, lost family men, but he also knew that even the cleanest blade still cut the same, whose eyes reminded him of someone he once knew. Inside him, unspoken lines he would not cross, even when told to. Lines drawn not in chalk, but in shadows and bone. He never tortured children unless the order came from a bishop. Even then, he hesitated, moved slower, handled the tools. There was no joy in the torturer's face ever. No smile, no glimmer of pleasure, only quiet routine. The dungeon was not. It eats the parts of you that matter and leaves only the hands behind. Every torture, that a single confession, and how it shook both the torturer and his apprentice to the core. A place for celebration, only obligation. You must leave before it kills you. He refused to use fire on the face. No laughter was allowed. The better, he said. Truth rots in the light. The more people saw, the more lies grew like weeds. He did not allow more than 2 witnesses during a session. The fewer eyes to take over for a day. The torturer stared at him for a long time and finally said, "Never ask that again. Not until you understand what it means to carry a scream in your chest." He kept no trophies, no teeth, no locks of hair, no bloodied cloths. The torturer believed in ritual, the tools laid out in a certain order, the candle placed in the same corner. He kept cleaning the tools himself, even after the boy learned. He never tortured the same person twice in one day. He believed in balance. He did not drink wine. He refused to torture women, pregnant or not. The body that held life was not to be broken. There was one prisoner who mocked him through the entire session. The boy asked why, and the torturer replied, "You can't silence a man with words. Only actions do that. Some speak because they're already dead inside." When a prisoner died during a session, the torturer did not return to work the next day. He sat in his chamber alone and said nothing. The dungeon remained still cold as bone and thick with quiet. Once the boy offered to take over for a day. The torturer stared at him for a long time and finally said, "Never ask. Get again. Not until you understand what it means to carry a scream in your chest." He said, "If you ever stop hearing them at night, you've become something you can't return from. And if you ever enjoyed this work." There was a list of names he kept in a small book, locked in a box. Not of those he tortured, but of those he refused to touch. Old friends, lost family men whose eyes reminded him of someone he once knew. The torturer believed that pain could be clean, that if done with care, it could serve order, not chaos. But he also knew that even the cleanest blade still cut the same. He told the boy once that the dungeon doesn't kill you with blood. It kills you with silence. Silence in your mind, in your sleep, in your bones. By the time the boy had been in the dungeon a year, he too began to feel those rules. He stopped asking why they existed. He simply obeyed them like the air or the stone, because they were all that separated the torturer from the thing he feared becoming most. They brought him in at dusk, a tall man with scars on his knuckles and a gaze that didn't flinch. The guards called him the Wolf because of the way he stared without blinking, like something that had seen too much to be afraid anymore. He had been caught during a raid, they said, accused of leading a band of rebels through the hills to steal from the king's wagons. The torturer asked no questions, just motioned for the man to be chained. The boy expected the usual fear. The trembling hands, the darting eyes, stammered pleas. But the man stood still, watching them both with calm that felt colder than any stone in the dungeon. They began with the simplest tools, small pressures applied slowly, places chosen for nerves, not blood. But the wolf made no sound, only looked straight ahead, as if his mind had left the room. The torturer did not speak either, only adjusted his grip and changed tools with the same rhythm as always. The boy watched closely, feeling something strange stir inside him, a tension that made his fingers twitch. Hours passed, and still no scream, no confession, not even a curse. The man's face was wet with sweat, but his lips stayed closed. His silence was louder than pain could ever be. They let him rest in chains that night, his arms stretched above his head, legs barely touching the ground. The boy brought him water and held the cup steady, and still the man said nothing, not even a thank you. On the second day, they used heat, not fire, but metal warmed until it glowed like a dying star, pressed close to skin without touching until the nerves begged the mind to scream. Still nothing. No twitch, no cry, no plea. The boy began to wonder if the man felt pain at all, or if he had buried it so deep no tool could find it. The torturer studied him between sessions, gaze slowly around him, head tilted like a scholar, observing a strange puzzle. He tried new combinations, new timings, new placements. The man endured it all. Fingers crushed, shoulders, twisted ribs, pressed one by one. And still his mouth remained sealed, as if the truth inside him had been locked behind a door with no key on the third night. The boy stayed behind after the torturer left. He sat near the prisoner, saying nothing, just breathing in the heavy silence. Finally, he whispered, "Why won't you speak?" The man turned his head slowly and said, "Because they would rather kill 10 of me than let one of them see fear." His voice was soft but clear, and it shook something deep in the boy's chest. The next day, the torturer tried something different. He brought in the strapido and hoisted the man until his arms screamed from their sockets. But when he dropped the prisoner back to the ground, the only sound was his breathing. After a week, the torturer's hands began to shake. He hid it well, but the boy saw it in the way he gripped the tools tighter, in the way he blinked more slowly. He was not used to silence winning. One morning, the torturer stood before the prisoner and said, "I will break you." The man smiled with blood between his teeth and said, "Then you do not know me." It was the only time he smiled in that dark place. Rumors began to spread through the castle that a man in the dungeon would not scream no matter what they did. The guards stopped laughing when they passed by, and even the bishop refused to look the torturer in the eye. The torturer began to change. He worked more slowly, spoke less, even to the boy, stopped lighting candles before the work began, and sometimes forgot to clean the tools afterward. The boy was worried about the silence, not for the prisoner, but for the man who once believed in rules and balance. Now, he moved like someone lost in fog, reaching out, but only finding more darkness. On the 9th day, they tried water, poured slowly over the man's face as he lay flat with his nose covered. But even as he choked and gasped, he did not scream, only stared upward as if watching something only he could see. The boy stepped forward during that session. He placed a hand on the torturer's arm and whispered, "He will never speak." The torturer looked at him, and for the first time there was fear in his eyes. They stopped the sessions after that. The prisoner was taken away, though no one said where. Some said he was buried alive. Others that he was released far from the city with a warning burned into his back. The torturer did not speak for 2 days. He sat in his chamber, staring at the tools as if they had betrayed him. The boy cleaned in silence, trying not to breathe too loud. On the 3rd day, the torturer said one sentence. He was the strongest man I have ever seen. Then he stood up and resumed work as if the silence had never happened. But something had changed. The boy could feel it in the air, in the way the dungeon seemed colder, even with the torches lit. The wolf had left behind no scream, no confession, only a shadow that wrapped around every stone. The torturer moved slower now, with less certainty. The boy noticed his hands shaking more often and the long pauses between actions. Sometimes he stared at the rack and turned away without using it. The boy dreamed of the prisoner often, not in pain, but standing tall, staring through him with eyes that never closed. He woke each time, gasping, clutching his chest, as if silence had wrapped itself around his ribs. That prisoner taught them something they didn't want to learn. That sometimes pain is not enough, and truth cannot be forced, and that silence can be stronger than any scream. It began slowly, like cracks in old stone. Not sudden, not loud, just small shifts in the way the torturer moved. His steps grew heavier, his eyes darker, his silence deeper than before. He forgot the order of the tools one morning, laid the thumb screws where the iron should be placed, left the bindings loose. The boy said nothing, just corrected them quietly and watched the man's hands tremble. He no longer muttered the quiet prayer he once said before beginning, the ritual that steadied his hands and silenced his thoughts. Now he simply stared at the prisoner as if trying to remember why he was there. The dungeon felt colder, even when the torches burned bright. The air hung heavier and the shadows pressed in closer. The boy felt it to a stillness that did not sleep. Once the torturer started, mid-session, then paused with the iron still glowing. He held it inches from the prisoner's skin and then turned away. He dropped it into the bucket without a word. The boy followed him to his chamber after that, found him sitting alone at the edge of the cot with his face buried in his hands. The tools lay untouched on the floor. Some nights the torturer paced for hours, back and forth like a caged beast, breathing through clenched teeth. The boy listened from the next room, too afraid to interrupt. He began to whisper things to himself, teams, mostly, and places. The boy couldn't always hear them, but once he caught the word mother, and something inside him twisted tight. He stopped sleeping in the dungeon, returned home each night, though the distance was long. But the boy heard from the guards that he didn't speak to anyone there either, just sat by the fire and stared. The screams began to follow him. The boy noticed how he winced at loud sounds, how his shoulders flinched when chains clanked. Even the wind in the stairwell made him freeze. He refused 3 sessions in 1 week, sent the boy alone to collect notes and prepare the table. When the bishop asked why, he said his hands were tired, though his voice was more broken than weary. One morning, he dropped a pear of anguish. It hit the floor with a clatter and rolled to the boy's feet. He didn't pick it up, just turned and walked away without speaking. He began to talk more, but not to others. To himself, to the walls, to the fire and the brazier. Half sentences and broken memories, scattered like bones across the air. He stared at his hands often now, turned them slowly, as if trying to see what had changed. The boy once heard him say, "These are not my hands anymore." The confessions didn't matter to him anymore. Even when prisoners screamed and begged, he barely reacted. He watched like a ghost trapped in the wrong century. His face grew paler and thinner, eyes sunken, skin sallow, lips always pressed tight. He looked more like a prisoner than the ones chained to the walls. He once walked into the chamber and simply sat beside a man who was bound, didn't touch a tool, didn't speak. They both just sat there, breathing for what felt like an hour. The bishop grew concerned, sent word to the castle. There were rumors he would be replaced. Rumors the dungeon needed a new hand. But the torturer stayed silent through it all. The boy began taking over more of the tasks, preparing tools, questioning prisoners, courting names. The torturer watched him with sad eyes, but said nothing. One night, the torturer finally spoke. He told the boy a dream had been chasing him. A dream where all the screams he'd silenced were now screaming at once, louder than thunder. He said they were climbing the walls, crawling through cracks, waiting in the corners. He said he could hear them in the wind, in the fire, in his heartbeat. The boy sat beside him and asked if he would stop. The torturer looked at the floor and said, "Stopping changes nothing. They already live inside me." On the final day, the torturer arrived before dawn, cleaned each tool by hand, oiled the wood, polished the steel. Then he laid them all out in a perfect line, like an offering to silence itself. He handed the boy a small key, said, "This unlocks the drawer beneath the table. Don't open it unless you have to." Then he turned and walked out of the dungeon without looking back. He never returned. Some say he wandered into the forest like the first apprentice and vanished. Others say he built a small hut by the river and lived there without speaking again. The boy never opened the drawer, not even once. He kept the key buried beneath the floorboard, wrapped in cloth, but he never threw it away. He became the torturer then, not by choice, but by silence. And every time he reached for the tools, he remembered the man who once held them and how even steel can break if bent too long. The dungeon was hidden beneath stone and shadow, but its presence reached far beyond the walls. The villagers never saw the tools or the chained men, but they felt the weight of it in their bones. Every scream that leaked through the cracks made the air colder, even in summer. People stopped speaking loudly in the streets. Laughter became rare. Silence became habit. Children were hushed by parents with trembling hands whenever the bell rang from the keep. The baker began to close his shop early. The butcher sharpened his knives in silence, eyes flicking toward the castle every time wind blew too strong. The smell of fresh bread no longer filled the streets, only smoke and worry. When someone disappeared, no one asked why. If a man vanished at dusk, it was whispered he must have crossed the wrong lord. If a woman failed to return from market, they said she must have known something she shouldn't. The boy who had become the torturer saw it all. He saw fear settling in like never before. Even the dogs tiptoed and the birds sang softly. Church sermons grew longer, filled with fire and warning. The priests reminded the people that order came with a price, and that sin must be burned out like rot from wood. Behind every prayer was the echo of the dungeon below. The village, well, once filled with laughter, now held only cold water and cautious eyes. Women whispered while drawing buckets. Voices low, heads turned. The dungeon was never named, but it lived on everyone's lips like a ghost. Merchants passing through spoke of the quiet town where people watched their shadows, where the Lord's men never smiled and the air tasted of ash. Few stayed long and fewer returned. A boy once shouted in the square and was grabbed by 2 guards. He returned with bruises and no words. After that, the children played only in silence, always watching the windows above. One old man told stories in the tavern until he spoke. It's the wrong name. The next morning, his chair was empty and his drink untouched. No one sat there again, not even the new travelers. The castle grew quieter too. The servants moved like ghosts. The guards whispered orders. Even the Lord seemed smaller, as if the screams had reached his bones as well. Some villagers said they heard the dungeon breathing, not like wind, not like stone, but like something alive beneath the earth. Its heart beat slow and deep in waiting. The new torturer strolled through town, and folks bowed their heads. Even the animals shrank from his steps, as if sensing the weight he carried. He never spoke to them, never smiled, never stayed. He walked like a shadow through smoke and returned to the stone where voices were broken and forgotten. The apothecary once refused to sell him herbs, said he would not give rest to a man who delivered none. The torturer did not argue, only left, and returned the next day with a scroll bearing the Lord's seal. After that, the apothecary kept his door locked when the torturer approached, left the pouch on the step without a word. No coin was taken, and no thanks given. Some began to dream of the dungeon. Nightmares of chains and fire, whispered names they had never spoken. Even those who had never seen its walls woke with sweat and fear in the sound of unseen screams. The toll grew in sickness too. Headaches, tremors, weak hearts. The healer said it was the air or bad meat, but the villagers knew it was fear. Fear settled in the lungs like dust that never cleared. Weddings were quieter, funerals shorter. Joy became a strange thing, like something borrowed or stolen. Even the festivals grew thin and gray, like shadows of what they once were. The torturer saw it all, but said nothing. He heard the silence in the streets, the stillness in the chapel. The way doors closed more quickly when he passed, carried it like another chain across his shoulders. A girl once approached him, holding bread. Her hands shook, her eyes wide, but she said nothing. He took it gently and nodded once, but the girl never came near him again. He began to wonder what peace meant in such a place. If fear was the only way to keep the world still, then what kind of world had they built? Was silence safety, or just a softer kind of death? He remembered the first torturer's words: order, not justice; fear, not guilt. And now he saw those words written on every wall, in every face, in every hurried step across the village square. A town that whispers too long forgets how to speak, and a man who listens too long to silence forgets how to live. Both were happening now, and neither could be stopped. Pete walked through the market once and passed a mirror for sale, caught his reflection, and barely recognized the face looking back. It was not the boy who once scrubbed blood from stone, but something else, something hollow. That night he stood in the dungeon with no prisoner before him, only the tools, the table, the candle, and the cold. He listened to the silence and knew it had one. The dungeon had grown darker, though no torch had gone out. The air was thicker, heavier, like the weight of every scream had finally settled. The torturer stood alone by the table, staring at tools that now felt colder than steel should ever be. He had not worked in 3 days. No prisoner had been brought, no session ordered, but he came still each morning, moving like a man walking through a dream he could not wake from. The silence no longer waited for night. It followed him in daylight too, clung to him like a second skin. He heard the chains rattle even when they were still, heard breath that didn't belong to him. His hands shook now, not just from exhaustion, but from something deeper. It's a kind of tremble that lives in the bones when the soul starts to crack. He pressed his palms to the stone, but the cold no longer grounded him. He walked to the far wall where the candle burned low, placed the tools one by one on the table in the same order he had learned years ago. The iron, the screws, the blade, the tongs, the cloth, each one had a name, though no one spoke them. Names whispered in pain, names etched in memory, names that came to him now without effort, like prayers he had never meant to learn. He lit the second candle, though there was no prisoner, no session, only a chair across the table and a mirror propped beside it. He sat down and stared into the glass. The face was not young, not old, just tired. The skin pale, the eyes sunken, the lips drawn tight. A man carved from stone and smoke in silence. He looked at his hands and whispered, I remembered them all. Every scream, every name, every breath. I remember them because someone had to. His voice cracked for the first time in years, not from pain, not from fear, but from the weight of what had been carried too long. The sound startled him more than any scream ever had. He reached into his cloak and pulled the small key, the one he had kept hidden beneath the floorboard all these years. He placed it on the table and stared at it like it was alive. The drawer creaked open after years, untouched. Inside lay a letter folded in leather and a small wooden cross worn at the edges. The torturer picked up the letter with shaking hands. He read the words slowly, barely breathing. It was a confession, not from a prisoner, but from the torturer who came before him. Written in slanted ink, full of regret and sorrow. It said, "I was not born cruel. I became it, piece by piece, name by name, scream by scream. And when I could no longer remember their faces, I wrote this so I would not forget my own." The torturer placed the letter beside the tools and wept, the sound soft and strange in the dungeon air, the first sound of sorrow the stone had heard in years. He looked into the mirror again and asked himself the question no one had dared to ask. Who have I become? Not what do I do or who do I serve, but who am I when no one is watching? The dungeon answered with silence. Not cruel, not empty, just quiet, as if it too was waiting for the final words to fall like ash. He began to speak, not to confess a crime, but to unburden a soul. I heard them, I watched them, I learned their names, and then I forgot them. I told myself it was for order, for peace, for justice, but it was for survival. His voice grew steadier with each sentence. I followed the rules. I broke the ones I couldn't bear. I whispered comfort when I could, okay, and remained cold when I had to. I did what was asked, but I cannot ask forgiveness because I don't know who to ask. He took the wooden cross and placed it gently on the table. Not as a prayer, not as a plea, just a mark left behind. Something to say I was here and I remembered. His shoulders sagged, his breath slowed, his eyes closed. For the first time in years, he looked at peace. Not forgiven, not free, but finished. He stood from the chair and looked around the dungeon once more. Not as a torturer, not as a boy, not as a tool. Just as a man who had nothing left to carry. He locked the drawer, returned the key to its cloth, and placed it back beneath the floor. Then he walked out of the dungeon without turning back. His steps light like a man walking toward sleep. The guards said he left before dawn. Passed through the gate without a word, wrapped in a gray cloak. No one stopped him. No one spoke his name. The dungeon remained. The tools were cleaned. The table was bare. The silence was different now. Not empty, not hollow. Just waiting. The dungeon did not close. Stone walls do not weep, and iron does not forget. It remained as it always had. Cold, quiet, patient, buried beneath the weight of silence and time. But something had changed after he left. The tools no longer gleamed the way they once did. Dust settled more quickly. The air hung heavier, as if even the dungeon knew its purpose had unraveled. The boy, now a man, sat at the edge of the chamber. The fire was low, the candles shorter than before. He hadn't touched a prisoner in weeks. Not because there were none, but because something in him would not move. He had taken the torturer's place years ago. Okay. But now that name felt too heavy, too sharp against the tongue. He was not the torturer anymore, just the one who remained. He walked the dungeon each morning without speaking, touched each tool as if to ask if it still had something to say. They answered, only in cold and steel and memory. The villagers no longer spoke of him. They had learned to live with his silence. Children were born, grew tall, and never learned the names of the screams their parents once feared. The castle above grew quieter with age. New lords came and went, none as cruel as before. They preferred coins over questions and feasts over fear. Orders for torture arrived less and less. Parchment grew brittle and seals faded. The dungeon was still feared, but only in stories told too late at night. He once opened the drawer and reread the old letter, the confession from the man who came before him. Each word sank deeper now, echoing louder in the stillness. He added his own note, folded it carefully, and placed it beside the first. No name, no title, only a few lines written in steady hand. I stayed until the silence became my own, and now I leave it behind for someone else to carry or forget. One day, he gathered the tools and wrapped them in cloth, not to use, not to bury, just to rest them. Each one laid gently into a chest, sealed with iron and dust. He locked the door to the chamber and placed the key high in the stone. No longer hidden, but not forgotten. A memory left above eye level where only the curious might reach. He walked through the village at dawn one last time. The air was soft, the sky pale with morning. No one noticed him, and that was how he wanted it. By midday, he had passed into the woods where the trees grew tall and the ground held no screams. He walked without looking back, carrying nothing but breath and thought. The dungeon remained, but it had changed. Without hands to guide the pain, without eyes to witness the breaking, it began to sleep. Dust gathered where blood once dried. Cobwebs formed across chains that no longer moved. The air lost its weight and grew still like a held breath that would never be released. Time passed as it always does. A new apprentice never came. The castle grew quiet and the village forgot. The dungeon became legend, then myth, then shadow. But if you stood at the edge of the old stone door and listened long enough, you might still hear it. Not a scream, not a cry, just a whisper. The whisper of footsteps that once echoed, of tools once held by trembling hands, of men who came in screaming and left in silence. And maybe, just maybe, if you pressed your hand to the cold door, you'd feel a pulse. Not of fear, not of pain, but of memory. The memory of a place that learned how to sleep. The dungeon did not die, it simply waited. And in that waiting, it found peace. The kind of peace that comes only after every voice has spoken. Every story has ended, and all that remains is stillness. So rest now in the quiet breath of stone and fire. The dungeon sleeps, and the screams are gone. The tools lie still. The air is calm, the story is told, and nothing more needs to be said. The dungeon sleeps now, and the world above has long since turned its eyes away. The heavy stone steps that once trembled under the weight of fear now sit untouched, coated in dust and time. The tools have gone quiet, not because they were broken, but because the hands that wielded them no longer remain. For years, it was a place of certainty, a place where pain was shaped like clay and silence was the chisel. Within those walls, men confessed truths and lies with the same breath. Not because they believed, but because they could no longer endure. Yet, as time stretched and the torturers faded from memory, the dungeon stopped breathing. It became less a place of punishment and more a relic, a monument to something the village no longer dared name. Those who remember do so in whispers, if at all. The elders speak of screams in their sleep, of candles that flickered even when the air was still. But no one listens closely anymore, and perhaps that is mercy. The dungeon itself holds no hatred. It is not cruel. It is not kind. It simply waited for a man to leave and never return. And when that happened, it did what nothing else ever could. It stopped. Not all silence is peace, and not all sleep is rest. But this silence, this stillness, is the kind that comes when there's nothing left to carry, when every name has been spoken. Every hand has fallen, and every echo has faded into stone. The man who left the dungeon did not disappear. He walked into the trees with the weight of memory and pain and perhaps even hope. No one knows where he went, and none followed, because some paths are meant to be walked alone. In the years that followed, the village slowly remembered how to speak. Laughter returned like birds in spring, cautious at first, then louder with time. Fear faded, not with fire, but with forgetfulness. The dungeon was sealed, not by order, but by neglect. Number guards posted no torch lit, no final word spoken. It simply faded into the earth, brick by brick, breath by breath. And yet, if you were to descend the old path one day, if you were to find the door still locked, but standing, you might press your ear to it and feel something faint. Not pain, not terror. Just the final heartbeat of a place that served its purpose and was finally allowed to end. The torturer's chair remains empty, the table clean, the tools wrapped and laid to rest. And the voices that once filled the stone halls now sleep as deeply as the man who last stood among them. In the end, it was never about cruelty or power. It was about silence, and how even silence can grow too loud if left untouched. But tonight, the dungeon sleeps, and the screams are gone. And if you've made it this far through the story, through the shadows and the sorrow, through the questions that had no answers, then you, too, can rest. Because the last confession has been whispered, and the final scream has faded. The door has closed behind it, and peace, at long last, has taken its place.